Thanks for coming here and actually decide to digest your lunch in my session. I promise it should be fun and dynamic, although the title itself probably doesn't promise too much, right? Application portfolio migrations are something, if you're looking on a very high level for a typical very large-scale enterprise, something that we did for forever very much. I'm in the industry for over 25 years, and I remember my first job was actually with a Big Blue, and we were doing modernizations, first from the old-fashioned mainframes into a more kind of a mini computers, and from mini computers to client server, and from client server to a three-tier architectures, and so on and so on and so on. So huge amount of assumptions that are usually coming when we are working on application modernizations now, moving, helping customers, large enterprises to move from on-premises to the cloud, is actually looking into that same old pattern that we are kind of using or abusing for over 30 years. Kind of you get the stack on one side, and then you need to move the whole thing over to another new type of the infrastructure. There are a whole bunch of misconceptions, and actually just as an opening of this session, I thought to list out a couple of anti-patterns that we see. They're very frequently happening, which very much, the first one, which is that lots and lots of enterprises assume or want to assume that the cloud environment will be just a little bit more clean and modern and automated infrastructure, but very much you can map one-on-one everything from the old environment into the new environment. Well, technically, yes, that is true, but if you do that, you are bringing all of your legacy problems with you as well. So you will see that one part of possible journey as part of a disposition is that we can allow lift and shifting, as we call that pattern. But new environment is not just a reflection of everything that you already built, regardless how virtualized and everything that already is in the on-premise data center. Cloud is bringing a massive amount of completely and radically different concepts and approaches. So that first one kind of doesn't really hold water. Also, if you're looking down the list of other misconceptions, the whole life cycle of how do you manage solutions have to change, and we'll talk about that a lot as well. How do you operate modern environments? Because you are running now in a cloud and everything is kind of a truly on-demand, scalable, and available kind of a turn on and off. You can actually start playing completely different type of operations game, including trying to look with a fault injection, which means that instead of operations trying to keep that whole geriatric pig alive, this is what we always did back in the old traditional data centers, you can actually start injecting faults, and you are going, well, will the whole system survive if we kill this node, or we kill this network, or we do this or that? So kind of you can actually play with new approaches to operations and fault resiliency and all of those modern patterns coming with it. People have to change. We'll talk a lot about people implicitly and explicitly in this session as well, and also all of the other concepts that maybe you heard of or you were in a couple of sessions either today or you'll be there tomorrow. All of the new modern cloud patterns and concepts can be, no, should be weaved into application portfolio migration. So the way how we approach that, or we saw how we approach that, and you probably heard Stephen talking this morning about how those journeys are quite different, and your mileage will vary, right? We don't have a single prescriptive pattern how we go from existing state where the whole set of thousands and thousands of apps are sitting on premises, all the way to what we call it all-in, that you migrated everything and you just decommission the complete data center. In last 2 years, I would say 2.5 years, we saw huge amount of those different journeys, different approaches. And initially, this was one of our early models, which kind of we try to create almost like a maturity model, the CMMI approach of capability maturity modeling of how do you move. You know, you go a little bit and you want to experiment, as you can see in the first stage, and kind of go further down the stack. This model didn't work, and actually this slide is false and outdated. So whenever somebody tries to tell you how the journey is linear and you have 4 stages and the only way is forward and so on, The problem with that approach is that different customers have very different business objectives why they need application migration scenarios. So we rewrote the complete migration strategy, and we actually decided to create way more flexible approach. This is one of the possible outcomes. This is not the journey now that you need to decide how you go through this state machine diagram, but this was made for one of the customers, where you need to decide first what is your ideal state. In some cases, it might be complete decommissioning of all on-premises, but not always. Also, you need to define where are you today. Are you completely traditional, or already in some kind of a hybrid mode? You already do try out some things. But it's not so much those states that matter. What we found out is it's primarily what is the business driver behind it. And as you can think, the driver, if your primary driver is to reduce costs, we will have a very different approach to application migration comparing to if your driver is growth stimulation or trying to diversify your business and actually allow either mergers and acquisitions or something like that. It is very, one of the typical examples of migrations to the cloud is preparation for merger or preparation for acquisition. We saw quite some of those really nicely played scenarios where a customer migrated to the cloud completely, and when it was acquired by another company, that acquisition on the IT front was just handing over credentials to that account in AWS. You can't do it cleaner than that. You literally tell to the new company, the new IT engineering, let's merge our IT. Here is now the common pool of resources. Let's say that you have 3 accounts, they have 7 accounts in AWS, and you just pool all of that together under same credentializing. And it's done. So that scenario would be totally different. Why you do things depends case by case. So we frequently spend with our customers a lot of work on assessment of your cloud readiness, of your objectives, way before we even start doing application portfolio analysis. So I hope it is very clear that application portfolio migrations, you need to look into the slightly bigger picture to understand why are we doing it before you go into how are we doing it. So before we go further on, let me just show you a sample complete migration, how it looks like. We usually start with a business case, but then we start building that whole sequence together for customers. And we go from cloud readiness assessment that you kind of saw very briefly on a previous slide. We kind of try to put the complete journey together. And then we go very much step by step. And again, let me reiterate that this is just one sample roadmap. This will probably not work for you. This did work for another customer where we did exactly this type of a work. And you can see that kind of how we slowly build on acquired knowledge, acquired understanding. We go through the assessment of application portfolio down there, and then we start working on a very specific build-up. First, we want to create a network connectivity. We create that hybrid infrastructure integration. In case you did not attend Paul's session this morning at 10 o'clock, it was very much mostly focused on that part, defining cloud environments, how do you actually integrate all of that together. And then you see application migration factory is it's one very important part of the whole journey. But the journey is much bigger than just doing very much. The core of my presentation is application portfolio assessment, which we'll touch in a second, data migration, application migration factory, and then operational integration. Actually, those things that I highlighted, I bolded up, they are the core of application migration strategy. But there are all of those other components that you need to follow up as well. You need to change organizational structure, you need to inject the training and readiness into it, and at the end of the day, you also need to readdress, are you running now more efficient, more cost efficient, and also much more agile than you did before? Because if you don't, comes back to the question, why did we do the migration in the first place? We saw lots of those programs are usually multi-year projects, right? And initially when the hype is high and everybody is kind of almost drunk on the newness of the cloud, everyone wants to ride on that mission. The problem happens after 6 to 8 months when there is a lot of work and the work is grueling and it keeps coming and the pipeline of 2,000 apps is now maybe 1,000, but you never see the end of the tunnel. You need to have a very clear higher order of a valued proposition. Why are we doing that? Otherwise, you will just go, it's boring and hard. And lots of particularly people that used to like to work in the old IT environment, and you didn't spend enough on a training and readiness how the new environment works, they will find that whole approach very tiresome. And we saw on programs that are driven very aggressively and extremely fast that sometimes you have a certain amount of particular operations people that feel that this is no longer a fun job. It is a fun job, but you need to properly prepare for it first. All right. So all of those little nice, fancy, hexagonal pictures, that are actually coming out from a couple of things. And I want to just lay out, before we go deeply down into the structure of it. On the highest level, we have 7 different perspectives. Most of what you will see today is coming from either process perspective, which kind of how do you sequence all of the things, because you need to manage. When you're talking about 5,000 app portfolio, it is all about proper governance and proper program management and portfolio management. Quite some of the things that we'll talk about are also from maturity perspective, which is all about assessing current state, defining future state, defining the gap analysis in between, and then based on that gap analysis, defining how are we actually approaching minimizing the gap. But the majority of the stuff will come from the bottom 2 perspectives, either platform or the operations perspective. This is kind of a conceptual, this is the framework. It doesn't tell you how to do things. We did develop also much more specified methodology. That's where it kind of becomes a little bit more harder to discuss that, because our methodology might not fit exactly every enterprise. Also, our largest partners, system integrators, will have slightly different methodology. So we all agree on the framework level, and yet when it comes to how exactly does the transition recipes work, we might have a divergent path to that. That doesn't mean that one is right, the other one is wrong. All of them lead to the goal. It's just that you understand, and when it comes to the methodology, you might hear slightly different journeys, slightly different approaches, maybe different stages will be in there and so on. At the end of the day, all of those recipes will bring you to the same type of a finished dish or the finished meal that you will have on a table. And then coming out from methodology, this is what we want to talk specifically in this presentation, is specifically application migration roadmap, which kind of on a very high level, we are talking about assessing the stuff first. You need to understand what's in there. And as you will see in assessment, we want to make sure that first we understand the portfolio. We jointly, you and us, we understand portfolio. But we also sequence it right. Because you don't want to go after mission critical, super hard and super integrated, ginormous workloads first. These are actually things that you want to keep at the end because you want to learn first. So you go for low business criticality and low complexity first. Then we want to do the platform integration. Data migration follows, and after that we actually create the complete migration factory that includes, we'll talk a lot about when do you decide to refactor versus just lift and shift? When do you decide that you actually want to go through modernization of the app that would benefit and get additional value from addressing the app that now runs in a cloud, and suddenly all of those new modern patterns can apply to it. Operational integration at the end, I think that Paul gave you quite some of the information at 10 o'clock. I will just briefly touch, but I will not go too much into it. Okay, so a little bit about methodology at the beginning. Our life cycle that we are usually recommending from methodology perspective to large enterprises, we are following the traditional COBIT plan, build, run. COBIT, for people that don't know that, controlled objectives in IT, it's like a more than 30 years old type of the framework that majority of a very large enterprises, commercial and private sector use. And within there, on a ridiculously high level, they always talk about you need to do plan, build, and run in a proper sequencing that you do things right. So we decompose that, and in a planning part, we are talking about the strategy and analysis, where very much you can see at the bottom on our methodology, you kind of come out with the application migration assessment. And so you look into why are we doing it, how are we doing it, and what will be the proper analysis of those apps. In the middle, under build phase, we are talking about designing and then already working on a transition. Design and transition, you can also maybe use in your own methodology. Development and testing and QAing and all of that is wedged straight in there in the middle. Couple of dispositions that are most common, you can see at the bottom that we off the hand always recommend. Think about how the rehosting will happen, which is just forklifting. You lift and shift over to the cloud. But ideally, for at least some top value workloads, we also want to look into replatforming, which means that you want to reshape those workloads to take at least some benefits of the cloud out. The most common one would be resiliency across multiple availability zones, or if you're a global company, across multiple regions maybe. So instead of running one instance or maybe two clustered instances within the same rack of the same availability zone, the same data center, that you want to start spreading that apart and make your systems way more resilient to any subsystem outages or failures. But we'll talk how reshaping can happen on any level, depending, do you have a source access, or can you negotiate with the vendor that made your app? Are you in-house IT strong, or are you completely outsourced? So the idea of replatforming gets suddenly, as you will see, many, many different shapes. And at the end, never to forget that after the migration is done, somebody has to operate it as well. So in the run phase, we are talking about both operations, but also that a cycle of improvement. Improvement became, in all of the cloud-focused life cycles, became extremely important because it allows you to do things wrong the first time. You actually incur technical debt on purpose in a first flush. You don't do the one yield right anymore, because it will bring you into analysis paralysis very, very soon. If you want to do everything correct in the first time without actually understanding that relatively foreign new environment that cloud allows you to create, you will do things wrong. But we want to create a life cycle that has that reduction of technical debt somewhere at the end, that you can address your IT environment consistently and regularly, and for every workload that you run, actually say, well, we are running it now for a year or 2 years, whatever your cycle is. Is it still on right platform? Is it still on right technology? Is it still with right vendor? And you create that continuous refreshment cycle, or you can, each and every time you can decide, yes, this is the only choice we have. This is the only vendor doing this, let's say, ERP solution. There is no other. Okay, and you leave it for 2 more years. But never just run something forever because, if it works, why would you fix it if it's not broken? Well, the new mantra here is, if it works, it's already obsolete. So you need to have that in mind, that don't make it too obsolete, right? Okay. So let's go down that stack. Application portfolio assessment, we usually, from a process perspective, in this lovely color, which I can't tell you which it is because I am colorblind person. So it is yellowish something. So we have a process perspective, a color-coded with that. So this is very, very process-oriented. We want first to collect all of the inventory. Ideally, we want to run collection tooling on top of the environment together with a customer and just harvest everything that we automatically find. You'd be surprised how few organizations actually allow us to run the automation of application information collection. They will rather give us a CMDB list. How many of you have a CMDB that actually is accurate and valid? I thought so. That's how we found it too. So CMDB and manual harvesting and manual creation of a list works, but it is 1,000 times slower than running automation tools. Entirely up to you. Then we need to hear from you, what is your criteria? How do we actually make those different buckets of apps? First, on what platform and how complex they are, how integrated with the other systems they are. Lots of apps have a very tight integration with identity, which means that we actually need to bring identity over to the cloud first and so on. But also, some of the platforms and some of the vendors are more cloud-friendly than others. So we need to create that segmentation. We also want to look into how do you treat from risk profile perspective, how critical your apps are. Are they mission critical? Are they business critical? Are they just important? Are they just a playground? And so on and so on. And combination of those things, so complexity versus criticality, drives the decisioning, how do we create the proper order of migration. We always try to create at least in a way that you start from easiest and least visible towards very hard and very visible and very complex. But you still want to create those regular beacons. Every month you should have an app that lots of people know about it, so you kind of visibly show in the organization how progress is flowing. Otherwise, if you are just doing trivial little tiny stuff for 3, 4, 5 months, you might get the false impression that everything will be easy. No, the hard stuff is coming later, and an even harder one is coming later. So then we'll go a lot into the migration options, into disposition options, which you need to define for your organization. There are a couple, and I'll talk in the next couple of slides of them. Actually, there are way too many, as you will see. You need to define the subset that works for you, and that comes with the tooling, and then you need to create a proper sequencing and a roadmap that you give to the project management office, somebody that will actually crack the whip and control how those things are running. When we're talking about the dispositions, this is usually how I try to explain those things to executives, to managerial level. On a super high level, this is how we would define a typical IT. It is not that type of an IT map that Stephen was showing. It's maybe double-click in. It's one layer lower. Don't look too much into those boxes. They are just kind of a nice canvas to actually show the core principle. If your focus is to move the OS level, compute level, storage level stuff, you are doing the shifting down at the bottom third of the slide. And we call that replatforming, right? You don't really know what runs on top. Actually, you don't even care what runs on top. Vendor gave you an app, or you bought an app, or whatever it is that runs on top. You are really focusing on that infrastructure layer, infrastructure services. So we call that lifting and shifting. And you can bring a whole bunch of different tools to do that pattern and kind of a move there. If you're in the middle, that you're actually focusing on application lifecycle management and you did development, so probably the core focus here is you actually have a way more access than just to that black box sitting on top of infrastructure. You do refactoring, right? You can actually rewrite and decouple the app, that instead of using the old concepts and old patterns of the old infrastructure, physical hardware and everything, that how we used to do things for the last 20 years. Now you want to make much more loosely coupled services, ideally go into a microservice architecture, but you need to have access to that rewrite capability, either coders and sourcing and all of that stuff. But you have a whole bunch of organizations that are actually telling you that all of that software is really terrible. The infrastructure is too low and the recoding is too hard. And if you just focus on business capability, and you have companies that are going, well, you run your business app here. We have our other business app there. You have CRM here. We offer another CRM. You have, let's say, line of business app here. I have another line of business. In that case, you can actually drop the old one and shop for the new one. So you need to start to compare capabilities of those old apps versus new apps. And as long as you go over magic 75% of cross-functional compatibility, you just repurchase. And you go, yeah, the time is that the old app dies. The old geriatric poor man, stays behind. And we go and buy something younger, newer. Again, this slide is for managers. Now let me tell you for you how that actually really works, right? Because it's far away from that simplicity. In general, the stream stays the same, right? We need to, as you saw so far, you want to go through the discovery, you build the environment design, you find the right migration paths, and then at the end, you do the correct integration. Now, a couple of options you will always have here is that you can either decommission or you absolutely don't touch, because maybe architecture, the hardware architecture is incompatible. You should never forget, cloud very much runs only on AWS runs on x86 hardware architecture. So whenever there is an AIX workload or anything like that, we have a much particular conversion from big endian, little endian. For you, they're old enough that even know what that means. These are hard, right? So some of the things you might actually leave behind. Now, majority of the apps will actually follow one of those journeys that you want to move the application infrastructure, you want to refactor, ideally for AWS, or you can do the minimal changing and just kind of use the tool for lift and shifting. And then at the end, find the proper migration process. You either just do the VM importing. If you're already virtualized in your data center, most of the customers in 2015 are or should be, or you use some third-party tools or something like that. You also get into more hairy-like scenarios, right? Where we are talking about much more refactoring. We're talking about complete replatforming and reusing new patterns over there. And then at the end, we're trying to also play with a proper analysis. Can we change, much more coming towards the DevOps type of a practices? How do we do continuous integration and continuous delivery? If you're looking into a native cloud apps, they are not migrated, as you probably know. They're built in a way that the continuous integration and continuous deployment allows the stacks, new stacks of the same application, of the same workload, kind of being created in parallel, and just with the DNS you flip over. And that allows you that kind of both development and infrastructure creation, kind of you create a pipeline that you can see 3, 5, 7 generations ahead. The things that are kind of flowing. Changes are flowing from one side, and new infrastructure, changes in the code, and modification on the infrastructure, and eventually they merge and go into the production. Probably the last part, going to operations, at the end, everything merges together. The ideal state, the best state that you want to be in, is that you don't need to have a human hands ever to touch your production service again. If you want to do any change on production service, you better build a new stack of production service. You replicate the data, you create a new stack of ideally stateless business logic, a new stack of ideally stateless front ends, or whatever the application architecture is, and then you flip over. So any change you want to do, you build it new again and again and again. What all of the analysis is showing us, the moment when you allow human admins to touch production, usually you will have a much higher degree of uncertainty what was really changed. How was it changed? Because we're humans, right? We do way more mistakes per unit of time than a typical, verified, quality-assured automation will do. Okay, so if I'm looking into that, then now you have an individual app, but one app at a time doesn't really make any decent integration. That's one of the core issues that we see the moment when your app portfolio goes over 50 apps or 100 apps. Now suddenly we're looking, how do we integrate all of that together? Not just with the identity store, but also in operations. There's a whole bunch of possible integrations that we do. At minimum, you want to have a good, full, complete integration on the infrastructure stack. That's mostly for very, very old-fashioned legacy apps that kind of app itself is not even aware that it is running in a cloud environment, above virtualized, so true cloud scalable environment. Better stuff is once you start to integrate vertically, so kind of ideally would be that you can call it as an IT stack, you integrate the whole platform as well as infrastructure, but the best type would be that integrated stack, that kind of you integrate the complete business capability with IT capability, with platform capability, with infrastructure capability. Now, if you're looking into the modern managed service providers, which are almost like system outsourcing partners of the modern era, they actually want to offer the complete set of integrated stack. They offer everything integrated, including incident management, patch management, and all of the human services that are usually coming on top of that. So how much of integration you actually do, it all depends, first, how much of a capability and knowledge you have in-house, and also what is your desired future state. Are you doing it because you want to create a completely new competitive advantage, or, like in case of a first picture, you just want to lower the cost? So your business driver will define how much of a platform integration you want to do. If I go a little bit deeper into the application migration for compute platform, we usually look into those 4 big things, how we move them to AWS. From host and OS cloning, which kind of we use usually tools, partner tools, and you will get the whole slide of them later, and kind of just try to create a complete binary replica of running machine that starts to execute on the AWS side. The other option is to use cloud as a disaster recovery replication, and actually Rich Uhl this afternoon will have his session on DR, which very much looks into the scenario that if your on-premises goes down, compute-wise, how do we make sure that you can, in that case, start using cloud as your secondary, warm standby, ideally hot standby data center? So how do you grab all of the required data but not really run it in a cloud? Cloud becomes like an, plan B. Then converting VMs, if everything is already virtualized on one side, there's a whole bunch of tools that will allow you to take that VM image and move it into the AMI, into Amazon Machine Image, and then run and execute on AWS. Or start to look into the proper containerization. So how can you actually make the app run like a container? This is mostly for a little bit more modern type of the apps, or the apps that you have access to the source, that instead of just saying, well, we'll grab the VM and you will recode it and now it will run in a cloud, my deep recommendation would be start to look into the Amazon Container Service, start to look into the Docker, and start to look into all of the ways, how can you actually isolate an app that runs as a container within a virtual instance. So actually you can start stacking multiple containers on a single instance if required, depending on the size. So it's no longer instance and app become one-on-one. Containerization allows you that you can start playing with one-on-many. Now let's look at the data. Lots and lots of people kind of forget that data migration, particularly the large data sets, is a big, big issue. Let me start first with engines itself. Relational database engines most of them were made way before cloud existed. And that's why database world has even though you will read about DB as a service, the traditional relational database always has a very hard time properly scaling. So that's why we still talk about the master-slave replicas and log shipping to another side and so on. These are not really good scaling models. One of the major reasons why so much of the industry is now actively looking into a NoSQL approaches is because NoSQL can scale any instantiation of a NoSQL model, can scale so much easily, can scale horizontally way easier than traditional relational database engines. But when we talk about how do you move the data over to the cloud, it all depends on how fast the data is changing. So if it is changing really slow, you can just kind of dump it on some disks, and particularly if we're talking about tremendous volumes, and send us disks, literally via DHL or FedEx. And we will ingest all of that data and we'll put it into S3 bucket for you and say, well, now it's in a cloud, do whatever you want with it. If we're talking about the smaller volumes, yeah, definitely you can just pump it over the internet, but still, you pump and dump into a bucket, right? Both of those bottom two scenarios are kind of very much one-off for a very slowly changing data. When the velocity is really high, you need to connect the old source and the new source and kind of keep them in sync for quite a while and then decide when the cutover happens. For a smaller sizes of data, you just kind of create a direct connectivity and use the typical low latency type of replication or log shipping and make sure that those two nodes are in sync. But there's a whole bunch of solution providers when you want to have you have a very high velocity of change on extremely large sizes of data. These are actually scientifically extremely hard problems. They're not trivial to solve. Coming into tooling, it all depends what engine you're running. And here I'm focusing mostly on relational databases because very few customers have an issue of building a NoSQL on premises and then trying to dump it over. That kind of a pattern would be really an edge case. So usually we really work hard on working with tools that are moving Oracle, we are still doing here, we are moving like to like, right? In case of Amazon Web Services, you have a couple of options. You can build the equivalent engine on top of EC2, which means that you will get your own compute instance, will attach the volume, will install the OS, will install the database on top of OS, and do everything in a very similar manner. Or we can kind of run it as a managed service for you, and we call it RDS, Relational Database Service, which can have any of those 4 engines running within it. Well, the 5th one, which is not on this slide, Aurora, is a cloud variation. If you're looking from the API perspective, it acts just like MySQL. So if you're looking from a migration tooling perspective, everything that applies to MySQL would apply to Aurora, although Aurora has a way higher performance characteristics than a non-rewritten or non-modified MySQL does. Now, when we're talking about application integration, particularly vertically across the stack, the big issue is how do we start to talk to architects about patterns across the stack? So vertical integration, when you can start using some services for another type. So we created a canvas that kind of tries to show how to properly map applications into cloud services. This would be a pattern that is an example of a website, right? You can see a browser over HTTP goes to, it looks like it's a Tomcat running on Java, sits on top of, in this case, BSD Linux, and on compute optimized instance, and so on and so on. You see the blue part, relational database? It looks like it's also consuming some relational data, but because relational data is fully managed, we don't even care, does it sit on a compute, does it sit on a network, because kind of a line of visibility stops right there. I have another example here, which would be, for example, a mobile app, which suddenly you can see that that vertical integration for app becomes way more complex, because we're still using similar components from the canvas, but because mobile app requires, particularly in application services, so much more, the canvas allows you to start modeling what is old, what is new, what I can reuse, and which services do I need to actually learn and start adding to our portfolio. Now, when it comes to operational integration, it's even more interesting. We see lots of customers, at the end, they end up with multiple environments. Very few customers move out from their internal on-premises and just run clean AWS. It might be also outsourced, it might also run another cloud on top of that, and suddenly you have operations people that kind of end up, in this case, with 4 independent environments that still need to be managed, operated, and whenever you create a really complex business application, we'll probably do the combination. The same business capability will run across 2, 3, or maybe even 4 environments at the same time. So if you are running operations on top of that, you need to understand when your business capability stops. Which part, which environment, where do you go into? So one of the first things that we definitely are pushing customers to do is to start to collect all of the core vitals across all of the environments. And because environments traditionally are so different, particularly if you're comparing outsourced environment with a cloud, it's dramatically different what you can get out. You can't even normalize any of that data that is coming out. Amazon Web Services will provide a tremendous stream of information of all of the assets, all of the configuration items, anything that we actually know that you run under your account. You can get that through Cloud Config or any of those other APIs that we offer in a continuous stream of data. Everybody else will do it differently. But the whole point is that you need to start collecting all of that into kind of a data warehouse, and that warehouse, after you start querying it correctly, will start to give you all of the answers to what do you have. And you can kind of get a CMDB report out of your state of your environments at 7 a.m. this morning, because it can be very different than at 8 a.m. this morning. There can be over thousands of nodes difference within, a couple of minutes or hours. Now, the other issue is, how do you control environments? As I told you, we really don't recommend that going to production, you do that with human hands. You want to do that with automation and with tooling and very prescribed, defined standards. So instead of having a 4 set of operational people that have logging credentials to go into each of those environments, we much more prefer that you build a type of automation that will have that runbook repository on the left that kind of injects the policies, injects the standards. In the best case, if we find the node that is out of compliance, that it's not following, let's say, your firewall rules, you should isolate that node and you should also alert the appropriate system somewhere upstream. And then you see on the top, then we also put the presentation integration layer on top of it. This is just a very, very high-level conceptual model how we believe the modern operations could be structured. And again, your mileage can vary. That model might not fit you. Now, just to wrap up, I don't have more, I think I have 2 more slides. First one is about all of the possible tooling. Don't think that AWS will provide you all the tools that you need for migration. We provide the platform. We're almost like a target platform, and we are very, very happy if you decide to choose us and run your workloads on us. But we have that massive amount of partner ecosystem that actually we stimulate with, depending on the use case, depending on your problem, there is a huge amount of solutions across the complete life cycle, from planning and strategy all the way into how actually execute, and at the end to do the proper operations and cost analysis and improvement of application portfolio migration. I actually think that because this slide deck, we update it almost monthly. I believe it is already outdated as well, because the last snapshot I took was about a couple of weeks ago. So that ecosystem of tooling that is available for you for migration, and not just tooling, also there's a huge amount of consultancy partners, and they're bringing their own methodologies and their own approaches. It all depends how you want to have it done for you. Do you want a white glove treatment that somebody else will do it for you? We can work with that. Do you want just to grab a bunch of very intelligent tools? We can work with that too. So it's entirely up to you what tool set you define based on what type of people are running within your organization. So to wrap up, application migration is a very important component of journey towards the cloud. It is very important. It has a very significant value for every enterprise. But don't forget that that perspective for application migration is mostly focused on the right side. You can see it in a platform perspective, top right hexagon, and operational perspective, bottom left. You can see the core questions that we are seeing coming from a typical large enterprises on the left. And huge amount of those questions, although they come out during application portfolio migration programs, are questions that are actually coming from much bigger spectrum, much bigger problem space. So that's why we always kind of, when we are helping large enterprises do the application portfolio migration, we always make sure that we try to keep that big reasoning, bigger picture in our mind. Because the moment when one of those questions or roadblocking questions will pop up, we need to be ready, particularly when it comes to security perspective. Never forget that, even when you're doing application portfolio migration, you might be blocked on a specific workload because you didn't prepare your own security team properly enough or early enough. Similarly goes to people perspective. I sat on projects where we planned everything for application portfolio migration, but very much HR function was really at unease that, will movement to the cloud just suddenly decimate the whole IT staff and what to do with them and all of that. We didn't prepare that people perspective properly and early enough. So there's a huge amount of proper awareness, preparation, training, planning, and strategizing to do so you can execute relatively tiny, small, specific sliver within the program. With that, I do have a takeaway slide, but that's much more relevant for people that will actually download the deck, which will be downloadable as all of the decks from today and tomorrow. I want to spend the last 5 minutes if there are any questions about the topic. Yes, please, can you go to the mic? Otherwise, I'll have to repeat the question that you are asking. Thank you.
So my question is, in your planning stages, the assessment phase, I feel you omitted a very important task, which is application performance baselining. What are your thoughts on that? Because after you move to the cloud, after you lift and shift, you really can't, if you don't have a baseline, you really can't tell whether performance improved or regressed. So any thoughts on that?
Yes, very good question. Let me start actually telling you how we do things. We always over-design initially. Performance measurement, performance baselining, and actually capacity planning historically was super important because you didn't want to overbuy, but also you didn't want to under-provision for a specific app. We will over-provision through the teeth when we take you to the cloud in the first iteration. We'll take an 8XL or whatever it will be, humongously, we'll always take a machine that we are absolutely sure that will take your load. And then we'll monitor it. And then a month later, we will go into the optimization cycle, because now when it runs in a cloud, so many different things are changing that very frequently we see that the usage pattern of your app is changing. So whatever performance measurement we would take in the old environment really doesn't have that much of a sense. So we always heavily over-provision, monitor and write scale about a month later or 2 months later or whenever you decide to do it, which is way more agile and really rapid approach to, let's make something big and we'll scale it down versus let's measure and define what is the right size instance and right size storage from the get-go. And again, mileage may vary. You might actually benefit from doing a proper scale, performance measurement and capacity measurement at the beginning. We just usually don't find too much. We want to shave as many days or weeks of the program as possible to make it rapid value realization. If you need to have that in the cycle, I absolutely agree it would be beneficial if you need it. Yes?
Yeah, I was wondering, could you give 1 or 2 examples for how an organization might do a hybrid integration with AWS where they have a web-based application that they're using for the front end, and they're going to have a huge amount of traffic coming in on the day of launch? How they could do that without crashing their dedicated servers, but also having...
Where were you at 10 a.m. when Paul was talking about that? So Paul has at least 2 slides. You can grab them from his deck, but on a very high level, the easiest way, let's say that you have the workload that is currently on premises, at least the part that you are really worrying about, depending on your pattern, at least you need to bring the front ends into the cloud. You need to bring all of the static library of, let's say you have a fancy imagery and videos, God knows what, into the cloud, into the content delivery network. And depending how heavy your business logic is, you might bring that over as well. The data layer, and again, depend on your pattern, usually front ends get most impact, business logic less, and then the persistent layer storage least. Depending on your time and depending on your connectivity, do you already have a direct connect or not? Front ends need to go into auto-scaling group with a load balancer. And that one will probably take 80% of your worries away. We use the CDN, Content Delivery Network, the cloud front, to cache all of the little images and videos and fancy stuff. Now, if you can then connect from front ends going straight back through the direct connect into business logic and into data, you're done, you're golden. Otherwise, if your analysis shows that your business layer is also suffering, bring that one over again, create another auto-scaling group, create another set of load balancers, and kind of do the same pattern as you did with the top one. And if that's still not enough, you bring the storage over as well, the database.
So you can do it in layers, and
you can do it in layers.
You don't have to do it you can do it. You can implement in a phased
Paul,
approach.
you need to talk to her.
Right? So you can what I'm saying is you can implement it in a phased approach rather than doing it all at the same time. Okay.
Yes. Please, sir.
Hi there. So I was on a call with a consultant the other day talking about basically a re-architecture of an app to make it cloud friendly, shall we say, or cloud native. And his suggestion was that when you make that sort of a move, you should do the re-architecture hand in hand with the migration as opposed to porting it and then doing the re-architecture, which I believe is what you suggested. So I wonder if you could maybe talk about the pros and cons of that.
Well, I think both approaches work. What is your primary target? Speed to be in the cloud? Or is your primary target to do the minimum amount of rework after you are done? If the rework is your evil and enemy, and you are buying external services, for example, you don't even have an in-house capability to do that, then doing everything in one go could be a good approach, because you want to have consultants in-house or system integrator in-house and do everything in one batch, and then you dismiss them at the end of the project and you don't need to call them back. On the other hand, if you're doing it with in-house resources, and this is something that you will actually use to learn cloud capabilities, and you don't have them yet in-house because your people are still learning the ropes, then doing it dirty first and then readdressing after you learn a whole bunch of new patterns that you never even knew that they exist is much better approach, because if you would go with the first model with your internal staff that doesn't yet know how to do things in a cloud way, you're actually forcing them to try to do things right on the platform that they don't really understand well yet, or they don't have the battle scars and proven practices yet.
Cool, thanks.
Hi, my name is Ritesh, and I want to thank you for a very informative session on cloud migration. Looks like it's a disciplined and a methodical approach to go to cloud with a large set of application. I'm curious to know your answer to what are the probably top 3 reasons which slows down enterprise IT migration, either slows down or stops the migration altogether, and what you are sort of suggesting for that.
Number 1 is people, number 2 is people, and number 3 is people. Sorry, but let me explain. Number 1, people in the leadership. They heard that cloud is great and wonderful, and they go, the other CIO told me that cloud is great, go to the cloud. And that's very much all that they care about. They don't get too much of an in-depth. They really just think that cloud will now lower the cost. And that will create initial push, but there will be very little follow-up because the value of the cloud was never properly defined. Second part is people that will architect it have the issue if you didn't train them well enough, they will treat cloud like for like, and they will very much think about cloud like automated infrastructure. Huge amount of, if you're looking out there, you will see a lot of offerings that you just you forklift and you dump onto cloud here, cloud there, cloud everywhere. And that meant if you have that mentality in architecture group that prevails, that might cause problems as well. And the third part is operations and security, people again. They will usually be the number 1 blocker because they don't understand how things actually work in a cloud. And if you don't spend enough of a time to teach them either DevOps practices or at least traditional system operations in the cloud, they will probably find the way to stop you on your wonderful, glorious journey towards the cloud, because they will say that I will never operate that pig. It doesn't look right to me.
All right, thank you so much.
Okay? And I'm sorry, I'll have to wrap up, but I will be available here together with Paul, and we have Tom here. We have a bunch of much smarter AWS people than myself here, and we are very happy to answer your questions if you still have them. Thank you so much.